Christmas was always a riot in our family. My parents loved throwing a party, setting the table, and giving gifts. Usually, everything followed the usual pattern. No one particularly expected surprises. But that year, everything was different. My younger brother, Dania, was the family favorite. He always got the best gifts, and my parents made no secret of the fact that they doted on him. I was used to it, although inside it hurt. That evening, we gathered in the living room and presents were already lying under the tree. When it came time to give them, my father handed Dania the keys to a new car. It was their pride and joy. They'd been saving up for a long time and wanted to please him. Everyone clapped and rejoiced, but I sat there, feeling ignored in the room. My gift was in a small envelope. My mother handed it over, saying it was just a joke. Inside was a lottery ticket. I smiled, so as not to spoil the atmosphere, and thanked him. On the outside, everything looked normal, but inside, a feeling of injustice was brewing. While everyone was discussing the car and making plans, I was sitting in the corner, turning that ticket over and over. The next day, I remembered it and decided to check. I turned on the TV and waited for the drawing. At first, I didn't pay any attention to the numbers, but the longer it went on, the more I started to tremble. Everything matched. I checked several times, thinking I was wrong, but no, the ticket was a winner. The amount was $85 million. My first feeling was shock. I sat in the kitchen, staring into space, not knowing what to do next. My thoughts jumped from joy to fear. I imagined my parents and brother finding out. Would they be happy for me? Or would everything turn out differently? I decided not to say anything for now. That day, I acted as usual, but inside I was burning. I was already imagining that I could start a new life where I wouldn't feel like a second-class citizen. The next day, I went to the lottery office. They checked my documents and processed the winnings. Everything was official. They told me the money would arrive within a few weeks. I left the building, sat down on a bench, and tried to wrap my mind around the fact that I was rich now. The first thing I did was withdraw some money from my account and buy myself an expensive phone. It was like a symbol. I no longer relied on handouts and random gag gifts, but the hardest part was yet to come. I knew I couldn't hide that kind of money forever. On the third day, my mother noticed the new phone. She asked where I got the money. I said I'd simply saved up, but a glimmer of doubt crossed her face. The situation was escalating. My brother, obsessed with his car, hadn't noticed yet. He spent all his time outside, driving around and bragging to his friends. I sat at home, wondering what the right thing to do was. Should I tell the truth? But what would happen next? My parents always thought I should share help, but with that kind of money, helping was out of the question. I knew it would change everything in the family. That evening, we had dinner together again. The conversation turned to finances, about how hard it was for my parents with the car loan. I sat in silence. At one point, my father asked me point blank why I was so thoughtful. I wanted to tell him everything, but I held back. I said I was simply tired. However, inside, a decision was already brewing. I couldn't hide $85 million forever. This secret was too heavy. On the fourth day, I went to the bank again, opened several accounts, transferred the money to different places to protect myself. Even then, I began to understand that I couldn't trust even those closest to me. The amount was too large. It changes people. I remembered my parents' faces when they handed me the ticket, and I understood that they hadn't put any meaning into this gift. For them, it was a joke. For me, it was an opportunity. The more I thought about it, the more I came to the conclusion that now I had to build my own life and distance myself from my family, otherwise everything would end badly. But taking this step wasn't easy. After all, they were my parents and my brother. I was struggling inside. Every day I woke up thinking that it was time to tell the truth, and every evening I convinced myself that it was not yet time. This went on for several days. But the situation spiraled out of control when my brother accidentally found a notification on my phone about a large transfer. He didn't say anything to my parents right away, but that evening he came to me and demanded an explanation. His eyes were blazing with greed. At that moment, I realized the worst had begun. When my brother saw the notification on my phone, his face changed. He tried to remain calm, but I saw greed flash in his eyes. He said he'd accidentally noticed the transfer and wanted to know where I got that much money. I tried to laugh it off, but he didn't believe me. With every word he spoke, it became clear he wouldn't let up. He started pressuring me, reminding me that my parents had always supported me, that we were family, and there shouldn't be secrets between loved ones. I knew where he was going with this and felt that telling the truth would be the beginning of the end. But keeping silent was no longer an option. I sighed and told him everything straight. I won the lottery, the ticket I got for Christmas was lucky, and now I'm the owner of $85 million. At first, he froze, then laughed as if he thought I was joking. But from my face, he could tell I was serious. Silence fell over the room, and he stood up and started packing around, asking questions about how much I'd already won, where the money was, and what I'd spent it on. I answered curtly and briefly. His smile disappeared, and he said I had to share because it was a shared gift from the family, so the winnings were also shared. Anger boiled inside me, but I held back. I replied that the ticket was my personal gift, and therefore the winnings belonged only to me. He flared up and started shouting that I was ungrateful, that my parents always gave him more because he was better, and now fate had decided to reward me, and I wanted to keep it all for myself. I knew there was no point in arguing and tried to leave the room, but he grabbed my arm and said that if I didn't agree to share, he would tell my parents everything. There was a threat in his voice, and I realized he wasn't joking. Then I said that my parents wouldn't be able to take the money from me anyway, because the documents were in my name, and even if they wanted to, the law would be on my side. These words only angered him more. He pushed me, and we almost came to blows. At the last moment, I restrained myself and said that if he wanted to destroy the family for money, then that was his choice. He left, slamming the door, but I knew he wouldn't stop. I hardly slept that night. My head was racing with thoughts about how to protect myself and the money. I imagined my brother telling his parents everything in the morning, and them taking his side. I even considered leaving home right then, renting an apartment and living on my own. But I decided to stay and see how things unfolded. My brother was acting strange in the morning. He was silent and wouldn't look me in the eye, but I felt like it was the calm before the storm. That evening, when we were all sitting down to dinner, he suddenly spoke. He asked my parents if they believed in miracles, and then added that one had already happened. Their eldest son had won a huge amount of money. My parents froze and looked at me. My mother laughed, thinking it was another of his jokes, but he repeated it seriously and told me everything I'd confessed to him the day before. The room fell silent. Everyone looked only at me. I knew the moment had come. I took out my phone, opened the banking app, and showed my balance. Their faces changed. My mother covered her mouth with her hand, my father frowned, and my brother beamed, as if he'd won. My father spoke first. He said it was incredible luck and that now we could all live a different life. He emphasized the word we, and it became clear to me that he already considered the money to be shared. Mom quickly picked up on this and started talking about paying off the car loan, buying a new house, helping relatives. My brother interrupted, listing the cars and things he wanted. No one asked what I wanted. No one considered that this was my money and my chance. I sat in silence, listening to their voices, and understood that now my life would never be the same. When the conversation turned to demands and plans, I firmly stated that I was not going to share. I was ready to help with small things, buy something for my parents, but the money belonged solely to me. A scandal immediately erupted in the room. My brother jumped up, shouting that I was a traitor, that because of me the family would fall apart. Mom begged me to think about it, not to be selfish. My father tried to speak calmly, but there was pressure in his voice. All three of them were against me. I felt like a stranger at my own table. When the shouting reached its peak, I stood up and said that if they only saw me as a wallet, I didn't want to be part of this conversation anymore. I went to my room, locked the door, and cried for the first time. Not from joy, not from happiness, but from pain and betrayal. I had won millions but lost the most important thing, my family. The next day, relations became frosty. No one spoke to me much. They talked among themselves, whispered, discussed plans, clearly excluding me. I began to fear they would try to take the money by force or deception. I changed the password on my phone and contacted a lawyer to secure my rights to the winnings. The more I strengthened my position, the further I drifted from my family. My brother tried to talk again, but he wasn't asking anymore. He was demanding. He said that if I didn't share, he would do everything to make me feel bad. His eyes were full of hatred, and I realized he was now my enemy. I was afraid to stay home, but I still couldn't bring myself to leave completely. I hoped they would come to their senses. But with each passing day, things got worse. I began to notice that my parents had changed too. Their views on me were different. There was no warmth in them, only calculation. I was living under the same roof with people who were no longer my family, and at one point I realized it was time to act before it was too late. After my brother resorted to outright threats, and my father increasingly repeated that I had to think about more than just myself, I began to live in constant tension. Every day became a trial, every word at the table a hidden jab. The three of them no longer tried to hide their attitude. They looked at me like a sack of money that refused to open. But one day, something happened that I least expected. Late one evening, as I sat in my room leafing through documents from the lawyer, my mother knocked quietly and came in. She sat next to me and was silent for a long time, then said she understood. I was surprised because before, she was the one who was the loudest in demanding that I share. She spoke quietly, almost in a whisper, so that my father and brother wouldn't hear. She said she saw how they were pressuring me, how my brother was becoming aggressive, and that it wasn't about family anymore, but about greed. She admitted that she was ashamed of how they were behaving, and that if she had won, she would have wanted to keep the money too. These words took me by surprise. For the first time in all this time, I felt like someone in the house understood my side. I asked her why she had supported them before. She looked down and said she was afraid to go against my father, and especially my brother, because he had always been hot-tempered and favored. But now she saw that things had gone too far, and if they continued to press, I would leave completely, and the family would fall apart. She didn't want that. She offered to help me, saying she was ready to cover for me and even keep secrets if necessary. I listened to her and didn't fully believe her, because just yesterday she had said something completely different. But I sensed sincerity in her voice, and that made me trust her. I told her that I had already transferred money to different accounts, that I was consulting with lawyers, and that I planned to leave home soon because I couldn't continue living like this. She didn't try to dissuade me, only asking that I not disappear completely and at least keep in touch with her. At that moment, for the first time in a long time, I felt some relief, but the joy was short-lived. The very next day, my father and brother began a new round of pressure. They began loudly discussing in my presence how they would spend the money, as if it were already in their hands. My brother brought home car catalogs, showed them to my father and mother, and told me which one he would choose. My father started talking about buying a plot of land outside the city. They even planned renovations, hiring workers, and replacing the furniture. I sat aside and realized they were simply ignoring my position. But strangely, my mother remained silent during these conversations or changed the subject. I could see my brother was irritated by her silence, but for now I didn't attach much importance to it. After a couple of days, he noticed that my mother had begun spending more time with me. She would come over, bring me food, and sometimes simply sit next to me and talk. Her behavior began to arouse my brother's suspicions. In the evening, I heard him arguing with her in the kitchen, accusing her of being too soft, of being a yes man. He screamed that I was manipulating her, and she responded that I was her son, and he should remember that too. The argument was long, and my father tried to calm them down, but it ended with my brother slamming the door and driving off in his car. I knew this was the beginning of a rift in the family. For the first time, my brother and my mother found themselves on opposite sides. It was strange and unsettling for me. I didn't want them to fight over me, but at the same time, I felt like I had an ally for the first time. That night, my mother came to me again and said she was afraid for me. My brother was increasingly saying he would solve the issue his own way, and she didn't know what he was capable of. She suggested that I at least temporarily move in with friends or rent an apartment. I hesitated, but her anxiety was contagious. I could see that my brother was becoming dangerous. The next day, he approached me and told me bluntly that he couldn't tolerate me anymore. He demanded half the money and threatened that if I didn't agree, he would make sure my parents turned their backs on me completely. His face was contorted with anger. At that moment, I realized there would be no peaceful discussions. That evening, I shared this with my mother again, and she proposed a plan. I should quietly pack my things and leave before they came up with something worse. She said she'd cover for me if my father or brother ever asked. I asked why she was helping me, risking ruining her relationship with them. She replied that she still felt like my brother and father had already lost all sense of humanity in this situation, and I was the only one who retained common sense. She didn't want to lose me completely. That evening, I packed my suitcase for the first time. I sat there and thought about how, in just a few days, my life had turned upside down. I'd won millions, but found myself an enemy in my own family. And only my mother, who had always seemed weak and driven, suddenly became my support. But I knew this was only a temporary balance. My brother wouldn't give in, my father would side with him, and a new wave of struggle lay ahead, tougher than before. When my mother admitted that she was ready to help me and that I should leave, a strange feeling of ambivalence appeared inside me. On the one hand, I was grateful for her support. On the other, I knew it was too late to save the family. The discord had become obvious. I walked around the house like a stranger, avoiding conversations with my brother and father. But one evening, my father came to see me himself. He entered quietly without knocking, sat across from me, and stared at me for a long time as if choosing his words. Then he said he wanted to talk without shouting or pressure. His voice was soft, even calm, and this immediately alerted me, because he usually spoke harshly and directly. He began with memories. He told me how hard it was for him and my mother to raise us, how he worked several jobs so that we had everything. He recalled how I was sick as a child, how he took me to the doctor, how worried he was. He spoke calmly and softly, as if he wanted to regain my trust. I listened and understood that he was playing on my feelings. Then he said he was proud of me, that fate had rewarded me with this win, but at the same time, it was a test for the whole family. He paused and added that support is important in any family and that money shouldn't separate us. The words rang true, and if it hadn't been for the last few days, I probably would have believed them. But now I saw something else behind them. I felt he was leading me to something. And indeed, soon he began making cautious offers. He said he understood how hard it was for me to handle such a sum alone, that it was a huge responsibility, and that perhaps it would be wiser to transfer some of the money to my parents to share the burden. At first, I remained silent. He continued, saying it would be safer that way, that my brother would stop getting angry, that the family would remain together if we managed it together. He even added that if anything happened, I could count on their support. The more he spoke, the more I realized this wasn't a conversation about family. It was a trap. His plan was simple, to force me to voluntarily hand over some of the money, so that later I would no longer have control. He hid behind words of concern, but a note of calculation crept into his voice. I asked him point-blank if he really thought I should hand over my money just because we were family. He looked me in the eye and said he shouldn't, but if he didn't, he'd be alone. There was no warmth in his gaze, only cold certainty. Then I realized the conversation had been prearranged. It wasn't a burst of emotion, it was a plan. Perhaps he and my brother had discussed the matter beforehand and decided that my father would take me with gentleness. I felt anger. Everything he'd said about my childhood, about caring for me, wasn't meant to bring up memories, but to manipulate. He wanted to pity me, to make me feel guilty, and to sway me to a decision. I replied that I appreciated everything they'd done for me, but the prize was mine and mine alone. Then his tone changed. He stopped speaking softly, his voice became harsh. He said I was making a mistake, that stubbornness would destroy the family, that I couldn't handle this alone. He stood up, looked down, and said he'd think about how to bring me to my senses. After these words, he left, slamming the door. I sat there and felt a chill run through my body. The conversation, which had begun with memories, ended with a threat. Now I was finally convinced. They couldn't be trusted. I told my mother everything. She wasn't surprised, just shook her head. She said she knew my father would do this, that his calm tone was always a mask behind which he hid his calculations. She advised me not to give in and to be prepared for the worst, because if gentleness didn't work, they would go another way. Her words scared me, but at the same time, I was grateful that at least she was there. That night, I didn't sleep again. I thought about how my father, who had always been an example of strength and honesty to me, had now turned into a man willing to play on my emotions for money. It was worse than my brother's yelling. Yelling is at least an honest emotion, but my father's calm speech was a blow from behind. I realized that my presence in the house was becoming dangerous. They could come up with anything to force me to give in. I began to consider the options of moving even more seriously than before, but leaving was difficult. I still had a glimmer of hope that everything could be fixed, that they would stop. But after talking with my father, I realized they wouldn't stop. I began to notice my father and brother going out together more often, whispering, hiding their conversations from me. Sometimes I caught their glances. They were heavy, unkind. And my mother kept repeating that I should be careful, even suggesting I put a lock on the door. I felt like the house was turning into a battlefield. But for now, I was ready to hold the line, even if it meant being alone against everyone. The morning began with a tense silence. My brother and father sat in the kitchen, talking in hushed tones, but as soon as I entered, the conversation broke off. I was used to their secrecy, but that day there was something special, a sense of anticipation in the air. My father called me in the evening to talk and said he wanted to discuss the future of the family. His tone was calm again, but now I knew the value of his calm. We sat in the living room, and he started with the usual lines about how we should stick together, how money is a test. But soon he got to the main point. He said he'd consulted a lawyer and learned that a ticket given as a Christmas gift could be considered a family gift. Therefore, the winnings could be considered community property. His words sounded confident. He'd clearly been preparing. He talked about the law, cited precedents, and assured me that the courts might rule in their favor. I sat and listened, feeling my insides tighten. This was a new weapon. If before they'd tried to pressure me with emotions, shouting and pleas, now they'd decided to resort to the law. My father said he and my brother didn't want a war, but if I persisted, they'd have to sue. And then the situation would become public, everyone would find out about my winnings, and I'd ruin my own life. His words were deceptively gentle, but the gist of it was simple. Either I voluntarily hand over part of the money, or they would drag me into a lawsuit and ruin my reputation. I realized the conversation had been carefully orchestrated. They wanted to force me into a dilemma where both options were bad, but I couldn't afford to give in. I told them I'd already consulted lawyers and that the ticket was in my name, meaning the winnings were mine. My father didn't flinch, just chuckled and said that every lawyer has their own truth, and the court would decide. I saw the confidence in his eyes, as if he already had me in his grasp. But what bothered me most was that he clearly wasn't telling the whole story. I sensed there was more to his words. And indeed, a few minutes later, he added, "They have a witness. My brother is ready to testify that the gift was intended for both of us, that my parents bought the ticket as a joke. But in fact, they didn't specify to whom exactly it belonged. So he was going to lie in court just to get his money." I looked at him and didn't recognize him. This wasn't my father, but a cold and calculating man, ready to manipulate the law to subjugate me. He tried to convince me that everything could be resolved peacefully, that if I signed over part of the money to my parents myself, we would avoid the court and the fuss. His voice was enveloping, but every word hit like a hammer. I understood that this was pressure, that there would be no peace. It was a trap. If I agreed, they would take part of the money and demand more. If I refused, they would drag me to court and make my life a living hell. I sat silently, and he took my silence for weakness. He said he would give me a couple of days to think about it, adding that it was best not to test my brother's patience because he was ready to go all the way. When he left, I felt like my back was against the wall. I told my mother everything. She was horrified, saying that my father and brother had been discussing this idea for a long time, and that they had actually consulted a lawyer. She begged me not to give in, because if I gave in, I would have nothing left. Her words were my only support, but they also sounded alarming. I understood that a legal battle is more than just words. If they decided to go all the way, I would have to face not only them but the system as well. And then I wouldn't just lose money, I would lose my freedom and peace of mind. The next day, my brother was acting defiant. He deliberately brought up the courts, throwing out phrases like, "It would be better if you gave it all up yourself than through lawyers." He walked around the house as if he owned the place, looking at me with disdain. There was something threatening in his demeanor, as if he had already decided the outcome. I began to think it was time to leave. Staying in the house, surrounded by enemies, was madness, but leaving meant openly acknowledging the war. I didn't want to, but I had little choice. Meanwhile, my father approached me again and said a lawyer was waiting for my call. He handed me his business card and added that if I agreed, they were prepared to amicably distribute the money, but if not, the court papers were almost ready. His smile was false, but his eyes blazed with confidence. I realized the manipulation had reached a new level. They weren't just pressuring me, they were playing on my fear of losing everything. And this game was just beginning. The uneasy silence in the house didn't last long. My brother increasingly provoked me, throwing out barbed remarks, talking about court cases, about how I wouldn't be able to stand up to my family and would lose anyway. But at some point, he stopped hinting and began acting openly. His behavior became increasingly aggressive. He came home late, slammed doors, made deliberate noise under my windows, and sometimes knocked on my door in the middle of the night, as if testing how afraid I was. My mother tried to intervene, but my father pretended not to notice or remained silent, as if giving him free rein. A sense of danger grew inside me. I sensed these were more than just threats. That evening, my brother burst into my room without knocking. His face was twisted with anger, his eyes gleaming. He started screaming that I had destroyed the family, that everyone was suffering because of me, that I was clinging to money that didn't even belong to me. I tried to speak calmly, but he wouldn't listen. He grabbed the documents I was looking through from the table and tore them up. They were copies of papers from a lawyer, and I realized he had done it on purpose to show his strength. He wanted me to feel defenseless. When I tried to stop him, he pushed me. For the first time, we had a real fight. We got into a fight, and only my mother, who came running at the noise, broke it up. She was crying, screaming that we were crazy, but my brother didn't even hear her words. He hurled a threat at me. If I didn't sign the papers and give him part of the money, he would make me regret it. His words were more terrifying than the blow itself, because in them I heard not just anger, but a determination to see it through. After that incident, I stopped feeling safe even during the day. I started locking the door, hiding documents in secret places, putting my laptop and phone in a backpack, and carrying it around the house with me. I felt like my brother could burst in at any moment and take everything he found. One day, I returned home and noticed that someone had gone through my things. The lock on the closet was broken, and the flash drive where I kept copies of documents and passwords was missing from the drawer. I immediately knew it was him. When I demanded an explanation, my brother merely smirked and said there were no strangers in the house, meaning I should be prepared to share. His insolence was astounding, but my father's indifference frightened me even more. He saw my brother was overstepping his bounds, but he didn't react. I took this silence as consent. Soon, the aggression escalated to a new level. That night, I heard someone trying to open the door to my room. The lock creaked, and I realized it was no accident. I sat in the dark, my heart pounding. I picked up the phone, ready to call the police, but at the last moment the footsteps faded. The next morning, I found marks on the door. The lock was scratched. I showed this to my mother, and she, horrified, tried to persuade me to leave immediately. But I hesitated. I didn't want to leave like a coward, leaving everything to them. But I knew that a little more and my brother would decide on something worse. The next day, he tried to start a conversation again, but this time not about the court or the law. He said that if I didn't want to share nicely, he would find a way to force me. His words were cold, like a sentence. I realized he had crossed a line beyond which there was no turning back. I couldn't take it anymore and told him that if he came near me with threats again, I would call the police. He froze for a second and then laughed. His laugh was unpleasant, nervous. He said that the police wouldn't protect me from my family. These words finally convinced me. He wouldn't stop. That evening, I was sitting in the room again, thinking about what to do. Mom came in and said that she saw my brother talking to some guys near the house. She was afraid that he would drag them into this mess. I felt fear squeeze my chest. If he decided to act with someone else, I would really be in danger. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the phone in my hand, ready to call the police at the slightest noise. I understood that my days in this house were numbered. This was no longer a home, it had become a trap. I didn't know when or how he would strike, but I was sure it would happen. And a single feeling grew within me. It was time to run before it was too late. The heavy tension between my brother and me stretched like a taut string, about to snap. I couldn't sleep peacefully anymore. Every night I woke up at the slightest rustle, afraid to open the door and come face to face with him. His threats became direct and open. He no longer concealed what he wanted. With each passing day, he grew more nervous and hot-tempered, and a fierce determination appeared in his eyes. I knew he was ready to move from words to action, and the only question was when exactly it would happen. The situation escalated that evening, when I was sitting at the table, checking documents on my laptop. My brother burst into the room without knocking, abruptly closed the door behind him, and turned the key in the lock. His steps were heavy, his breathing harsh, and his gaze seemed to indicate he had completely lost control. He was holding a bag and tossed it onto the bed. Inside were empty bottles and some papers. He said he was tired of waiting, that he wasn't going to talk anymore and demand that everything be resolved right now. His voice was cold and tense, and I sensed it wasn't just intimidation. He came right up to me and demanded that I hand over all the documents, the keys to the safe, and access to the accounts. I tried to protest, but he grabbed my shoulder and slammed me hard against the wall. My vision went dark, and for a second I lost my balance. Pain shot through my temple, but the worst thing was the feeling that this time he wouldn't stop. I realized we had passed the point of no return. I lunged for the door, but he intercepted me and pushed me back. We grappled, and a fight broke out. He was stronger, heavier, and his every move was filled with rage. I tried to fight him off, but he punched me in the face, drawing blood onto my lips. His scream echoed in my head. "Give me the money, or I'll make sure you can never use it again." The words sounded like a death sentence. He pinned me to the floor, trying to tear the laptop out of my hands, but I held on with all my might. Anger, mixed with fear, boiled inside me. I knew that if I gave in, he wouldn't stop. He'd keep pushing until he destroyed me completely. At some point, I managed to break free, hit him with my knee, and crawled to the table. I grabbed the lamp and swung. He retreated for a second, but his eyes flared with even greater rage. He lunged at me again, and we fell to the floor together. The noise was so loud that my mother ran in. She screamed, trying to separate us, but my brother pushed her away so hard that she fell. That moment pierced me like a knife. I realized that he had lost all boundaries, that for him, there was no longer a family, only the goal of taking the money. He grabbed me by the neck and started choking me. His fingers dug in so hard I was choking, my eyes filled with tears, and it seemed like another moment and I would lose consciousness. In desperation, I grabbed the first thing I could find, a pen lying on the floor, and jabbed him in the shoulder. He howled in pain and jumped back. I gasped for air, my throat burning, my heart pounding. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by my wheezing and his ragged breathing. He looked at me, his face contorted with hatred. He said it wasn't over, that I had signed my own death warrant. His words were terrifying because I realized he was ready for anything now, even crime. My mother cried, trying to persuade him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. He left the room, slamming the door so hard the glass shook. I sat on the floor, feeling my whole body tremble, and knew this was only the first round. He hadn't gotten his way, but now he knew I wouldn't give in, which meant his next attempt would be even more dangerous. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I gathered up the documents, hid the laptop, and began planning what to do next. I knew I couldn't put off the decision any longer. It wasn't just about money, but my life. If he made another move, he wouldn't stop at threats and a fight. And then, perhaps it would be too late. I sat in silence for a long time after the fight with my brother, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands still shaking from the strain. Up until that moment, I'd tried to endure, thinking I could hold out, that holding the line would be enough to keep what was mine. But after he'd grabbed my throat, I realized the most important thing. I couldn't wait any longer. Any weakness would lead to me ending up in the grave, and him at the helm, with millions that would become his weapon against everyone. Something inside me snapped. I knew it was time to stop being a victim. I stood up, gathered my documents, laptop, and bank keys, and hid everything in my backpack. The next morning, I called the lawyer I'd already consulted and told him everything, revealing every detail. He listened silently, then said, "Now you have to get tough. If you let them push me any further, it will end badly." His words sounded like an order. We agreed to meet at the office, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had an ally ready to stand by my side. The first step was to arrange security. The lawyer insisted that under the circumstances, I needed to protect myself physically. Within a day, I had 2 people assigned to me. They stood guard outside the house and accompanied me to meetings. This decision changed everything. When my brother first saw them at the gate, his smug smile vanished. He realized I was no longer defenseless. His eyes had been blazing with anger, but now there was a flicker of confusion in them. For the first time, I felt like I had evened the playing field. My father tried to maintain a semblance of calm. He said I'd gone too far, that hearing security against my family was a betrayal. But I could see that deep down he knew we'd entered into open warfare. There was no room for talk of peace anymore. The second step was a legal attack. Instead of waiting for them to file suit, I filed a complaint myself. A lawyer prepared documents stating that I'd been subjected to threats, pressure, and even physical violence by my brother. Attached were photographs of bruises, scratches, and a damaged door. To complete the picture, we prepared a police report of the assault. Once the authorities had the papers, my father and brother stopped smiling. Now they were the ones on the defensive, but I didn't stop there. I decided to hit them where it hurt most, their reputation. I contacted a journalist I trusted and carefully told my story, concealing their identities. I described the situation. A guy won a large sum in the lottery, and his family tried to deprive him of his right to the money through threats and violence. The article came out a couple of days later. It quickly spread across news sites and forums. People discussed and argued, but most importantly, society witnessed what was happening. My father was furious. He shouted that I had shamed the family, that now they would point fingers at us. But I knew that was exactly what was needed. The more attention the story received, the less opportunity they had to operate in the shadows. Now their every move would be under scrutiny. My brother, on the other hand, was truly furious. He tried to break through to me, but security didn't give him a chance. I saw him racked with helplessness. He screamed, threatened, promised to break me anyway. But now his words lost their power. I was no longer the man locked in a room, waiting for the storm to pass. Now I was the storm itself. With each passing day, I increased the pressure. Lawyers prepared new documents, security stepped up its surveillance, and the police had already begun an investigation into the attack. I was prepared for a long fight ahead, but for the first time in all this time, I felt like I was not being led, but leading a game. That evening, my mother came to me and whispered that she was afraid for me. She knew my brother wouldn't stop and that my father would support him no matter what. She cried, begged me to leave home, at least for a while, but I told her that now everything would be different. I wasn't going to run. I was going to make them regret every step. And inside, I already saw it coming. Courts, threats, and more clashes lay ahead. But I had everything I needed: money, lawyers, security, and most importantly, determination. The family war had reached a new level, and now I was ready to go all the way. Mom always remained the only person in the house who did not try to fight with me. She did not threaten, did not shout, did not demand to give up the winnings. On the contrary, she tried to be on my side, at least in small things. Sometimes she brought food into the room. Sometimes she just sat next to me and was silent. And I understood that for her this war was even harder than for me, because she found herself between two fires. On one side her husband and eldest son, on the other me. And her heart was torn into pieces. I saw how every day she became weaker: tired eyes, sleepless nights, trembling hands, and even her voice sounded quieter. One night she came to me, sat on the bed, and quietly said that she was afraid for me and for herself, because my father and brother had completely lost their bearings, and it was no longer possible to stop them. She asked me to leave, at least for a while, to leave everything and save myself. She said that money was not worth us losing each other. And I listened to her, but I could not agree, because I understood that if I left, they would think they had won and then find a way to take what was left, and I couldn't let them dictate my life. But at the same time, every word she said cut me from the inside, because I saw how she was literally fatting away before my eyes because of this conflict. The morning after our conversation was a turning point. My mother couldn't get out of bed. She was shaking, her face turned pale. Her blood pressure was off the charts. I called an ambulance and went with her to the hospital, where the doctors said that she had severe stress, nervous exhaustion, and heart problems, that if the situation didn't change, the consequences could be irreversible. And then I was overcome by a feeling of guilt that I hadn't had before, because until that moment, I saw only enemies in the family. But now I realized that my mother was an unwitting victim whom I had dragged into my war. Returning home, I caught myself thinking that for the first time I was thinking, is it worth continuing all this if for the sake of victory I will lose the only person who loves me? But as soon as I went into the house, my brother pounced with more threats. My father hissed that I disgraced the family and brought mother to the hospital. And all their aggression again turned my guilt into determination, because I realized it was not me who was to blame, but them. It was their greed and anger that destroyed everything. And if I break now, then my mother will suffer even more, because she will be alone with them. I began to strengthen my protection even more harshly, transferred my mother to a separate room with security, agreed with the doctors so that information about her condition did not fall into the hands of my father and brother. Because I did not exclude that they would try to use even her illness as a tool of pressure, and these suspicions were quickly justified. My father called me and said that he was ready to make peace, but on the condition that I refuse part of the money for the good of the family, and that supposedly then my mother will get better. I listened and understood that this was not concern for her health, but another manipulation, an attempt to press me against the wall through the most painful place. He knew that my mother was sacred to me, and this is exactly what he tried to take advantage of. But inside I was all constricted with anger. I understood that my mother could really die if this continued. And that is why I have to finish the job and pull her out of this nightmare, even if it means crushing my own brother and father completely. That night, I sat in the car near the hospital and thought that my war had long ceased to be just a fight for money. Now it was a fight for my mother's life and for my future, and whether I could withstand it or not depended on whether she would survive. For too long, I convinced myself that everything that was happening could still be fixed, that my mother would recover as soon as this hell with the court was over. But in reality, each new day brought more and more anxiety, and her weakness became too noticeable. Her eyes grew dim, her movements slowed down. The doctors said the same thing. Severe stress, an exhausted heart, lack of peace, and constant conflicts are doing their job, and I caught myself thinking that I was becoming a hostage to this struggle. I won hearing after hearing. The lawyer assured me that the case was almost decided in my favor. My father and brother looked more and more pitiful in the courtroom. Their arguments collapsed, and the public and the press laughed at their greed, but I didn't care, because the main thing was happening not in court, but in the ward. Where my mother was turning pale before our eyes, I came to her every evening, brought flowers, held her hand, promised that soon we would go somewhere where it would be quiet and calm, that I would do for her a house by the sea, where she could walk and not think about everything, and she smiled. But this smile was weak, like the reflection of a candle, which would soon be swallowed by darkness. One night I woke up from the phone call, and hearing the doctor's voice, I already knew that the worst had happened. At the hospital, I was greeted with silence and the heavy gaze of the nurse on duty. My mother's heart could not stand it. Resuscitation lasted half an hour, but they could not save her. And at that moment, I realized that I had lost. Despite all the money, lawyers, security, and victories, I lost in the main thing. Because the person for whom I tried left, leaving me alone in the void. The funeral became torture for me, standing at the grave. I did not hear the words of the priest, did not see the people around, only felt how everything was collapsing inside. My father stood nearby. His face was stony. My brother looked with hatred and reproach, as if I had killed her, and this thought did not leave me, although I understood that it was their constant pressure and greed that drove her to illness. But the guilt, the feeling that I had not protected her either, burned the most. After the funeral, I couldn't leave the house for several days at all. I didn't pick up the phone, didn't talk to a lawyer, didn't open accounts. Money ceased to mean anything. It became a heavy burden, a reminder of the price I paid. But the system continued to work. The court announced the final decision, completely securing the winnings for me. All attempts by my father and brother to challenge his rights were rejected. Formally, I became the winner, received control over all the funds. But there was no joy, only emptiness. And then I decided that I couldn't just go on living as if nothing had happened. I transferred large sums to charities, supported medical centers that treated cardiovascular diseases, paid for operations for children and the elderly, because I felt that if I didn't help others, I would finally go crazy from the realization that money did not save the life most dear to me. My father withdrew into himself after my mother's death, but he didn't stop blaming me. He told everyone that I destroyed the family. My brother became even more aggressive. He started having problems with the law because of debts and constant fights. But I didn't care. I distanced myself from them completely, because now there wasn't even an illusion of kinship between us. I understood that I won the war for money, but lost the battle for the family. I was left alone, with millions in my accounts and with an emptiness in my heart. Every night my thoughts returned to the moment when my mother took my hand and said that money is not worth life and peace of mind. And I understood that she was right. But too late. Now all my wealth has become a reminder that I have lost the most important thing, and no amount of winning will ever be able to bring back to me the woman who was the only one in this family who truly loved me.